So today, our speaker, architect Alan Hess, will enlighten us about that most famous architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, whose organic style of architecture, inside and out, has had a major impact and influence on modern architecture today. So let me introduce to you Alan Hess. He is an architect, an architecture critic, historian, author, educator, and preservationist. He is considered the preeminent authority on modern architecture and urbanism in the mid-20th century. He is the author of 19 books and 100 articles and essays on subjects such as John Lautner, Oscar Niemeyer, the architect of Brasilia in Brazil, Frank Lloyd Wright, the Ranch House, Gucci, is it Gucci or Googie? Googie architecture, and he's going to tell you about that maybe, I hope. Las Vegas and Palm Springs. 5 of his 19 books are about Frank Lloyd Wright. He is also an architecture critic for the San Jose Mercury News, a contributor to the Architects newspaper. He is a grant recipient from the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts and a National Arts Journalism Program Fellow. He is also on the board of a newly formed organization, Preserve Orange County, advocating for the conservation of historic sites in our county. He has received numerous awards, including the Honor Award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Documono's U.S. Award of Excellence, and the President's Award from the Los Angeles Conservancy for 3 decades of work preserving modern architecture. The LA Conservancy's many words of praise include the following. Mr. Hess has elevated the roadside and commercial architecture of post-World War II to its rightful place in the canon of architectural history. He challenges us to rethink what's worth preserving and why. In 1995, Mr. Hess wrote, "The examples are not obvious. We must look for them carefully, even if they are beneath our noses, so much a part of the fabric of the life that they are not noticed as significant. We must train ourselves to see beyond the boundaries of current taste. There is a hidden history that deserves and demands exploration. How can a coffee shop or a hamburger joint be noteworthy? How? Hess states very clearly, it's a design that's inseparable from its time, place, and people. That's what really good architecture is. So today, Alan Hess will share with us his extensive knowledge of the architecture and influence of Frank Lloyd Wright. Please join me in welcoming Alan Hess.
Good morning. It's very good to be here, and I just want to say at the start, I am so encouraged that the Powers Museum is having an exhibit on architecture. Out of all of the great cultural institutions in Southern California, really only the Getty really makes any attempt or has an architecture department. None of the others have really focused on architecture. They've eliminated their architecture and design departments in many cases, which I think is sad. As Rhonda was saying, architecture is about many things: purpose, function, structure, but also beauty and design. And the first slide that I have up here has nothing to do with my talk, but it does illustrate the fact that there is design in many, many places. You just have to open your eyes to it. Well, I'm going to be talking today about Frank Lloyd Wright. I thought I would talk first of all about his ideas, his concepts, and where they came from, to give you kind of an overall view about how Wright's particular look and aesthetic and design fits into the larger world of architecture. And then I'm going to do a section on his career as well. A really interesting career, a bumpy trajectory over you know, he lived to be over 90 years old. Born in 1867, died in 1959. So he had time in that period to have basically 3 separate entire careers, any one of which would have made him one of the most important architects in history. But he kept reinventing himself. He kept pushing himself. Well, I'll be getting into that in just a bit. But Frank Lloyd Wright, we know a lot of his work. He is still, now again, many years after his death, he is still a name which is known and associated with architecture. But when you look at some of his buildings and some of his designs, these are to a skyscraper hotel in Texas and in the Los Angeles Hills on the right-hand side. This was a kind of a luxury personal spa for Huntington Hartford, the heir to the A&P market chain as well. Never built, but as you can see, something completely out of the ordinary and the mainstream from that time. But even with those extraordinary buildings which are not built, there were extraordinary buildings which were built. This is the Marin County Civic Center up in Marin County, which was one of the last designs that Wright worked on, and it was completed after his death. But it remains as, I believe, one of his major monuments. It is because society, culture, politics were all central to him. He had an overarching philosophy about what society should be, that it should be connected to nature, that democracy was an important idea, but how to express that in terms of the way that people lived in the cities, in their houses, in their churches, in their civic centers. We're going to be talking about this. This is an early building and one of his early great masterpieces, the Roby House in Chicago, which this particular building absolutely changed world architecture. Other architects, especially in Europe, were just overwhelmed by the ideas in this house. We're going to be talking about that more in depth. One of my favorite buildings, which unfortunately burned in a fire, is no longer there. This was in Scottsdale, Arizona, overlooking the Arizona Biltmore, which was another Wright design. This was a house for Rose Pawson. But look at how different it is than the Roby House earlier. You can see that how Wright is constantly rethinking, reinventing what he is doing. Now we should see these Wright houses, which and buildings, which we can call organic architecture. That's probably the easiest way to identify his approach. And we'll go into it. It has many facets. It's not an easy concept or a simple concept, but it basically says that architecture is related to nature. And the concepts, the philosophy, and the structure of nature. So that this can have many different facets to it. For example, the structure of a tree, perfectly designed for its function. It has roots to get nutrients. It has a trunk as a solid foundation and center for the building. And then it has branches and leaves and flowers. Each, obviously the flowers of a tree look very different than the roots, and yet they are all working together organically to create the tree. That was a very important philosophical concept in Wright's designs. And it's very different than what we often today call modern architecture. We kind of narrow down what modern architecture is to strip down minimalist, often machine imagery of buildings like, one of the original buildings in this aesthetic was the Bauhaus by Walter Gropius from the early 1920s in Germany. Or down here, the Farnsworth House by Mies van der Rohe, which again you can see the structure is expressed. It's steel, it's glass, it's modern materials, but very, very severe, very rigorous. And then in skyscrapers, this is the not the Seagrams, the Lever House in New York by Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. And you can see the evolution of these ideas, of simple geometries, of exposing glass, of not having ornament on the building. This is often today mistakenly thought of as modern architecture in the popular imagination. One message I want to get across today is that Frank Lloyd Wright and his organic architecture and all of his followers, incidentally, when I give a talk in August during the exhibit here, I'll be talking about a number of his followers, students who continued and had a great influence on modern architecture, which looked nothing like these international style, the name for this style, the international style of architecture. And I'll be talking more about Googie architecture at that time, because that is one of the aspects of Frank Lloyd Wright's legacy to us in the 20th and 21st century. Now, as I said, the Bauhaus was founded in 1919 in Germany. Actually, both Walter Gropius and Mies van der Rohe were influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright, who was a generation older than them, already well established when they just were getting started. But one of the myths about modern architecture is that it started in Germany or in Europe with the Bauhaus, and that's what modern architecture was all about, and that's the end of the story. Well, this is not true. Modern architecture really started in the United States after the Civil War. And there are a number of important architects that I want to introduce you to who influenced Wright. Wright's a part of their evolution. For example, Frank Furness in Philadelphia in the decades after the Civil War. Now, these buildings that you see by him, that's the library at the University of Pennsylvania there on the right. They may look to our eyes as Victorian, old-fashioned. In fact, they were, at their time, extremely modern, using modern materials and putting them together in entirely new ways that reflected the machine technology of those times. Because Philadelphia, in the late 19th century, was the Silicon Valley of those times. That's where technical innovations, corporate innovations were being developed. The Pennsylvania Railroad, based in Philadelphia, which changed the face of America by transportation, by changing people's sense of time, places where people could vacation, where they could live. The sense of speed was changed. And then how do you organize an entire continent with these railroads? Well, the Pennsylvania Railroad, using modern technology, was redefining modern life. And Frank Furness was one of their chief architects for their railroad stations, for some of their corporate headquarters, etc. Now, sometime in the 1870s, a young architect came to Philadelphia, was looking for a job. And he wandered around the city, and the buildings that impressed, he was impressed by a number of buildings. So he asked, who designed this building and that building? And they said, Frank Furness. Well, that young architect was none other than Louis Sullivan. And Louis Sullivan got a job early in his career with Frank Furness. He appreciated the sense of modern concepts expressed in architecture. And of course, Louis Sullivan went on to really, in many ways, invent the modern skyscraper. That's the Wainwright building on the right in St. Louis, a tall, strong, vertical building which expressed its steel structure, but also had ornament on it. Again, I want to stress this. That's an example of Sullivan's ornament, based upon natural forms, the tendrils, the flowers, the ideas and the forms of nature, which he integrated. Instead of classical or Gothic details, he went to modern nature. Of course, well, going back to Furness, one of the good family friends of Frank Furness and his family was Ralph Waldo Emerson. So you have this connection to this new American philosophy, especially about nature, but also the nature of man as well, which you see following through Furness, Sullivan, and of course, Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright came as a young man around 20 years old to work for Sullivan in Chicago, and of course, that's the subject of our talk today, so there's a lot more to say about him. But you see these same ideas, reinventing new types of buildings, like the skyscraper, that's the Price Tower in Bartlesville, Oklahoma there from the 1950s. But Wright also used and integrated ornamental elements. He wasn't going for a minimalist, stripped down architecture. He embraced ornament, but he was very inventive and original. So moving on to his philosophy and his ideas. These are a couple of slides from the Solar Decathlon, which was held at the Great Park here in Irvine 2 years ago. Universities around the country tried to, each had teams which applied modern technology to creating a house that was sustainable, that used sustainable materials, that responded to the sun, and instead of using energy to cool or heat it, how can we use nature to cool and heat and make our houses pleasant to live in? So this is, as I'm sure you all know, a very topical issue today with our need to get less dependent upon oil and other unrenewable resources. But the thing is that this understanding of nature and how to use nature goes right back to the beginning of Frank Lloyd Wright's design. He was interested in this way back in the 19th century. Now, in many ways, he integrated his buildings into nature. His buildings responded to the site, to the materials, to the stone, to the sky, or here at the Walker House in Carmel, to the Pacific Ocean itself. So that the building is not standing away from nature, it is right there in the middle of nature. And here you see several examples of his houses in various places around the country, different climates, the South, Pennsylvania, Michigan, through the seasons, where his buildings and their colors, their materials, their siting, all relate to the natural setting. This is an extremely important concept to Wright. Wright always talked about nature with a capital N as a religious idea, really. It was a spiritual idea. But there is a practical side to this as well. I mentioned this before. The Roby House from 1908 in Chicago, right on the campus of the University of Chicago. Now, this exhibits many of the basic ideas of modern architecture. It is simple horizontal lines. It is nothing traditional in terms of the forms or the ornament. It has a lot of glass. In fact, this house and Wright's other work inspired, as I mentioned, the next generation of European architects, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, and others. There was something so new, so fresh about this. It looked different and was beautiful, and it inspired their use of simple forms. But there's another layer to this building. How did Wright get these simple forms, these horizontal lines, these wide eaves? This was not simply an aesthetic idea at all, not just a formal idea. He was responding to the Chicago environment, Chicago nature. Now, I went to high school in Chicago. I know it's bitterly cold in the winter, and it's depressingly hot and humid in the summer. You got 1 or 2 weeks right there in spring, which is really beautiful. But he responded to that with these wide eaves, these long horizontal wide eaves. What do those do? In the summertime, when the sun is high in the sky, it keeps the sun out of the center of the house. And in the wintertime, when it's cold and the sun is low, it allows the sun into the house. And the house is brick, a massive heat sink, so that you heat up the interior brick walls of the house, and then it radiates the heat out through the night. So this design is not just modern for the sake of being different or unconventional. It is responding specifically to nature and the comfort of its residences. There are a whole bunch of other aspects of this. That chimney, for example, has ventilation going up, which takes cool air from the basement area up into the top floor master bedroom. So there's a lot more into this, but this is the beginning of modern architecture, really, as we know it today. A couple of other examples of Wright's houses. You see these wide eaves, the one in the upper right here. You can see, because of its orientation facing the south, this eave is very wide. On the north is not so much sun, it's a short eave. Or down here, this is a fascinating invention as well. These coffers along the eave allow light to be bounced around and to get into the house. So you don't have a dark house, but it also keeps out the direct sunlight that you don't want because of the heat. So this influence is response to nature, influenced many things. Here's another example where, again, on the north side versus the south side of the house, Wright is orienting glass or a solid wall. So all of these are the elements that bring about his sense of using nature. Natural light as well, so that you don't have to have electrical light through the day. This is the Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois, from 1905 or 6, I think. This building, incidentally, has just been restored, and beautifully, I understand. But it does have these skylights overhead, which allow natural light to pour into the center of this auditorium or the church. It's just an exquisite building. Or another interior, this is a residential, and you see again here how Wright is responding to the orientation of the building. On the left, the backyard facing south, you have all of this glass. On the north side, which faces the street, you want to cut out the noise and the lack of privacy on the street side. So you just have these clear-story windows right up near the roof. But because you have those, you balance out the light inside the house. You don't have dark shadows and then bright areas as well. All of these things were what Wright was thinking about in his buildings. Or this temple outside of Philadelphia as well, Philadelphia, where the roof is actually a sandwich of plastic and glass elements that flood the interior of the building with natural light. Solar mass. I mentioned a little bit about this, but with the Roby House, but Wright took this idea even a little bit further with what he called the solar hemicycle. This building is curved and facing south so that the sun, as it moves through the sky, will bring its light and its heat into the center of the house, where the stone or brick walls will absorb the heat and then radiate it out again during the night. Again, not using oil or electricity to heat the house, but using nature to heat the house. Similar idea in this church in Madison, Wisconsin as well. You see all of those stone walls along the side of the sanctuary. Those were also solar heat masses in order to absorb heat and energy and radiate it out. This building was added to recently. I talked with the architect of the new building that was added to this church complex, and he said, yes, it works. This idea still works. Another idea are berms. Those are mounds of dirt. And in this house, one of the second Jacobs house near Madison, Wisconsin, he buried the house partway in the ground, molded dirt up along its sides, again, to use nature, dirt, as an insulation for the house as well. Ventilation. Also, natural ventilation important. And an early house, this is one of the Prairie School houses from the first decade of the 20th century as well. But notice there on the left, this wide porch as well. And notice how the glass of the living room there on the first floor, you can see all the way through it, so that you can open the windows and you can get ventilation through in the desperately hot, humid summers of Chicago. Or this very inventive thing from 1950. This again is the Walker House on Carmel Bay. And notice how the windows are stepped in. Well, these vertical elements are fixed, but where it steps in, which is right along here from the inside as well, they have vents. They have openings so that this is right on the ocean. You don't want the sea breezes coming directly into your living room. But because it's this horizontal ventilation system along these lines, the wind is broken and you get the ventilation but not the full force of the wind. And that again gives a form to this kind of semicircular living room. Notice also important idea for Wright interiors, the built-in furniture as well, going all the way around. Natural materials. Well, that's what I'm going to talk about. Wright used natural materials, often from the site, whether it was different kinds of stone, desert stone in these cases, or this is a house back in New York, a different kind of stone, but the building, his buildings in New York have a different character than his buildings in Arizona because he's using natural materials, stones, bricks, or wood. Evaporative cooling. This, again, is a house in Scottsdale, Arizona, and he integrated water features as well so that in the in the heat of the Arizona desert, evaporative water would naturally cool the atmosphere. He carried this idea on a little bit further at Fallingwater, one of the most famous houses, where in the living room there is this hatch. These panels slide back, and there's steps down to the river, which runs through the house, basically. Here you see it. These are these steps right here. But on hot summer days, this was a vacation home for the summertime in western Pennsylvania. But at that time, you could open up this hatch, and the sense of the water, the coolness of the water would come up into the house as well. Again, a great idea, but what's important is the way that Wright uses that idea to give the building form and shape. Radiant heating. Wright always used integrated heating. This is a column in one of the early Prairie School houses, but it has in this case, a furnace heating hidden as this decorative element of the living room. Later on, inspired by Korean architecture that he had seen, ancient Korean architecture going back hundreds of years, where they piped hot air from a furnace through pipes under the floor of the houses, and this heated the house. Well, he adapted that system in many of his later houses in putting hot water pipes through the concrete floors so that the floors themselves heat up with the hot water and create, in the 6-foot zone where people inhabit, a warm environment, even during the winter in these areas. The Stipple House was another idea. We think of many of Wright's great houses like Fallingwater and others, which were beautiful custom homes for wealthy people. And that's one aspect of his work, definitely. But all through his career, he was interested in designing houses that would be for the average person. Literally, that the average person could build themselves. And he came up with building systems for walls and other things where the average person could either build it themselves or really direct a contractor, understand it well enough to have a contractor build an affordable house. Not big houses, but affordable houses with these open plans and modern designs. Wright called this concept the Usonian House. And here are a couple of examples. As you can see here, it just melds into its environment. And on the interior, the use of skylights, the way that here this dining area with the kitchen right over here to the right, but just flows into the living room area as well. He was against the box. He exploded the box. So that instead of having a box for a dining room, a box for the kitchen, a box for the whichever other rooms you have, these social spaces of the house flowed together and flowed outside as well through the large glass doors. The natural city. Wright was a big thinker. He wasn't just designing individual buildings. Each building that he designed fitted into his larger concept of what the American city should be like. And he was just a devastating critic of traditional cities. He hated Manhattan, too crowded, too dense. It jammed all of these skyscrapers together so that you couldn't appreciate this, the beauty of a soaring building going up, meeting the sky. In many of these concepts, for example, early on in his career, he designed these row houses here in Chicago as well, a high-density housing form as well. And then this is an interesting concept as well. They were prefabricated apartment units. These were built in Milwaukee as well. So he used prefabricated elements, just like Model T cars at the same time were being built through prefabricated elements that were then all brought together on the assembly line. So he applied that modern idea to apartment housing. And then this down here, this is a farmhouse. He designed actually a couple of farmhouses. So he was interested in both the city and the countryside. In fact, that was also a major idea for the way that he conceived of this new city. This is a drawing of Broadacre City. Broadacre City was an idea he started evolving in the 1930s and worked on for the rest of his life, which took all of these ideas about how to rearrange the American city more logically, more organically, more connected to nature. So it was basically horizontal. It was connected by transportation, either cars here or these are helicopters that Wright designed. Not real sure about the physics of these particular helicopters, but they certainly look like they belong in this modern city. But it's mostly the automobile tied together the city. But look at all of this open space. This is agricultural. This is farmland. So he interspersed farmland with high-density, high-rise housing and market centers and all the other elements that you need in a city. But instead of jamming everything together, he reorganized it so that there was open space. And in fact, the building block of this Broadacre City was, let's see if I can find a house. Some of these houses, each individual private home had an acre of land for people to grow their own food, raise their own livestock for their own use, and then they would take it to the market centers to sell their excess. So he had this whole economic plan to reorganize the city as well. Very interesting. I mean, he was doing these ideas, as I said, starting from the 1930s. This is the back to the farm, farm to table concept, which is very popular today. Wright was thinking about this 70 years ago and designing not only houses but an entire city for that concept. So those are some of the basic ideas. There's so much more, but those are the important ideas. Organic architecture, using nature, designing for nature, using natural materials, looking for affordable ways to build as well. But now I want to talk a little bit, just give you an overview, very quick overview of his career, which was scandalous, astonishing, enraging to many people. Here he is in his office at Taliesin West in Scottsdale, Arizona. This is sometime in the 1950s, and you can see, here he's still thinking about skyscrapers here in the lower right-hand corner, and you see that he's surrounding himself. And he did, well, he had many people working for him as well, but he was also a great drawer and draftsman, and these very distinctive style of drawings that he used are just gorgeous. Behind here, this is the Guggenheim Museum, the model for that. Frank Lloyd Wright was born in 1867 in rural Wisconsin. This is what the landscape looked at. He grew up on his mother's and his uncle's farms in this beautiful rolling landscape. If you ever are near Madison, Wisconsin, take an hour and drive west out and visit Taliesin East. But there he learned to grow food on their farms, the family farms, and to build roads and barns and so forth. So he really started out in a very agrarian way, which made sense for most of America in the 1860s and 1870s. But he did go to college for a very short time at the University of Wisconsin in engineering, but he dropped out. He did not feel it was really teaching him anything, and he moved to Chicago and got a job with Louis Sullivan. This is the Guarantee Building by Louis Sullivan, one of the buildings that Frank Lloyd Wright worked on. And here's the Guarantee Building, and you can see how strikingly new and modern it was compared to these other buildings around it. Tall, vertical, but then with this wonderful organic ornament. Wright was not one to praise other people. He praised himself quite a lot. But he always talked about Louis Sullivan as his Liebermeister, his master. And he always honored Sullivan. Very interesting kind of relationship. Actually, Sullivan eventually, Wright was Sullivan's right-hand man at the age of 21, 22. But he fired Wright because Wright took on some bootleg projects on the side, and angered Sullivan, would not have his employees working on other things. So he fired Wright, and Wright went on, set up his own office. They later reconciled, and they were, Wright, as I said, always admired Louis Sullivan and his work. But he started a family. He had many children. And he built, actually originally with a loan from Louis Sullivan, he built his family home there in Oak Park, Illinois. Now, this is an important element as well. Oak Park is a suburb of Chicago. It's not in the center city. And Wright, in many ways, is a suburban architect, because suburbia, the development of the city from the center core out into the margins of the city, is a major theme of urban planning and modern architecture throughout the 20th century. And those of us here in Orange County can really understand, the appeal of living in suburbia, connection to nature, having a backyard, and so forth, and then commuting into Chicago for work. As you can see, this is a shingle-style house, and here is Wright. This is the front steps of this house. He treated this house as a laboratory through the years. He was always changing it, always altering it. But here's Wright over here on the right, and this is his mother, and this is his wife, Catherine, and then this is one of his sons. It's probably Lloyd Wright, and then one of his babies as well. This was his Uncle Jenkins also, who he did a very interesting social center in downtown Chicago for as well. So here was Wright, and he was, as I said, went on his own after Sullivan fired him, and had a period from roughly late 1890s up until about 1950, which we call the Prairie Style. And it again is a suburban style of architecture. The Hertley House, which you see here, is one good example. Notice the wide eaves, notice the lot of glass. Here's the front door, and it's brick. But notice how the brick has different striations, layers on it as well, to give it a texture ornament. Very different from the standard Victorian houses of the time. So here you can see how startling Wright's ideas, and it grabbed the attention of architects as well as the rest of the country as well. But he was experimenting. This was a fascinating thing with him. He was really somebody who, in his artistic efforts, was always needed to have a new problem to work on. So at this time, he was working on the problem of the modern house and the appropriate form and plan for that. So sometimes, in some buildings, he went vertical with this, one of the Martin houses in, again, Oak Park, Illinois, in his own neighborhood. But he finally settled on horizontality. He called these the prairie houses because they have the line of the horizontal prairie of the great American Midwest. This was the Willits House on the North Shore of Chicago, which really defined all of these elements for the first time entirely in one building. And again, you see the wide eaves, collecting the windows so that they are ribbons. And then the structural expression of this wood frame house is expressed on the exterior in these vertical lines, these horizontal lines, the porches, and so forth. This is the classic prairie house. But that wasn't all that he was designing. He was also designing factories. This is the Larkin office building in Buffalo, New York. And he was designing churches. This is the Unity Temple in Oak Park, Illinois, out of concrete, monolithic concrete. And he was also designing places of pleasure. This was Midway Gardens, which was kind of like a beer garden, indoor-outdoor beer garden for Chicago as well. But look at how, again, the ornament gives a sense of delight, of music, of escape for this sort of social area. So, Wright bowled over the architecture community with all of these ideas. Many other people were working with him. And this idea of the Prairie Style spread throughout the American Midwest. But Wright, always needing something to gain his attention, lost interest. Once he had solved that problem, he didn't want to just keep repeating it. And he didn't want to just be a suburban house husband for all those years. And so he was attracted to other women, particularly Mema Cheney, the wife of one of his clients, to build a house for the Cheneys. And he ran off with her, and he built up in his homeland of rural Wisconsin a house called Taliesin. And this is it in suburban or rural Wisconsin. But, of course, this is where the scandal and the tragedy comes in. 1914, one of their servants apparently went crazy, blocked the doors, set the house on fire. Mema Cheney was there with her 2 children and some of the other servants. And as Mema and the children and others fled the house from the fire, this servant killed them. And a great tragedy, scandalous in the newspapers. Wright was at work in Chicago at the time, devastated him. Absolutely. He really loved Mema Cheney. And the house was destroyed. Rebuilt, though. So he went through a very difficult time. At that time, that was not the way to get proper clients, by having a scandal that was on the front pages of all the Chicago newspapers. So he was beginning to have a hard time getting clients. He wasn't interested in repeating what he had done. So he took on a new project, the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo. And he traveled over from about 1914 to 1922. He traveled back and forth across the ocean to oversee the construction of this house. He thought this was going to put him back on top. And it's an extraordinary building as well. But by 1920, 21, 22, when it was finished and started to be published, architecture had moved on. It wasn't interested in Frank Lloyd Wright anymore. And Wright did not have any more clients. He did not know what to do with himself at that time. He considered coming out to Los Angeles, and he did for a time. This was the office. He didn't design this building, but this was the office he had in Los Angeles with his son, Lloyd Wright, in the early 1920s. He came out to build, this is Olive Hill in East Hollywood area, and he had a client, also an extremely unusual client, Aline Barnstall, an oil heiress, and they built together Hollyhock House, which of course is still standing, is open to the public as well. It was to be a much larger complex. It was to have a school in it. This is the drawing for the school on the edge of the hill. That was never built. But Wright designed a number of houses out of concrete block, a system he devised, which, like the Millard House here, seen inside and outside. So notice how here, in a different natural setting than Chicago and the Prairie, here in Southern California, he still was inventing new forms, but responding to the climate and the topography of Southern California. So these buildings are nestled into the ravines and on the hillsides of Los Angeles and Pasadena. And they're out of a material which is actually much better because it absorbs heat and keeps the interior cool during the hot summertime as well. Same principles, different forms. The Ennis House is another example. Unfortunately, this has been in very bad shape, as you can see, but fortunately, it was bought by a person who had a lot of money and has restored this house. He tried a lot of other different ideas. These are cabins, floating cabins for Emerald Bay at Lake Tahoe. Never built, but again, an interesting idea for a resort. But Wright, always looking for something new, in the late 1920s, moved out to Scottsdale, Arizona, actually Chandler, Arizona to begin with. That's Wright and his wife, his third wife, Ogivana, and Ogivana's daughter, and then their daughter together, Iovana, as well. And he built this compound, temporary compound, just for the winters, out there near Chandler, Arizona. He also, in the late 1920s, worked with the MacArthur brothers to design the Arizona Biltmore, which is still standing, a very Wrightian building. But in the early 1930s, he got this idea of, along with his wife, Ogivana, of creating a fellowship, a school. And so they opened up and they said, to any young architect in the world, you can have the great honor of working alongside Frank Lloyd Wright at the Taliesin Fellowship, if you pay us. So again, Wright had no clients. He was always strapped for money. And this was one of his ways to get back on the scene, to generate some money, to generate workers for his many projects, and also to spread his ideas. So this is from the early, mid-1930s. Here's Frank Lloyd Wright in the middle. This is at Taliesin East. A number of his really very, very important apprentices. This is William Wesley Peters. Right behind here, though, this tallest guy is John Lautner, a great Los Angeles architect as well. So through this dry period, Wright was, doing whatever he could to keep things together. The apprentices didn't just draw architecture. They built roads, and they farmed crops, and they sold crops at the local market, whatever it took to keep the community going. But then in 1935, 1936, two commissions come along, which change Wright's fortune. Fallingwater, here, this vacation house for Edgar Kaufman. Here it is under construction, built on a river and a waterfall as well. And this house, when it was published in 1936, absolutely captivated the architecture world globally. Here was Wright, who was at that time considered a has-been, who had done some good work in the past, but it was forgotten. And suddenly, all of this energy was back. And again, Walter Gropius, Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier were amazed at the concepts of this house. But that wasn't all. The Johnson Wax factory and office buildings in Racine, Wisconsin, same time, and just blew everybody away. An entirely new concept for an office building as well. And again, this put Wright on top again. The Usonian House that I described came along in this period. This was the first official Usonian House, the Jacobs House in Madison, Wisconsin, building for the average person. So what does Wright do at this time? Suddenly, after 20 years, he is accepted and praised and written about and talked about again. He has clients coming in finally. Anybody would have, at that time, moved their office to Chicago to take advantage, or New York, the centers of the media and the architecture communities. But what does Wright do? Contrarian that he always was, he moves to Scottsdale, Arizona, which literally at the time was a one-horse town. There was nothing in Scottsdale at that time. But he saw the future. He saw that there was going to be this demographic shift in America to the Southwest, to Los Angeles, Phoenix, Texas, etc. And he went there to use and draw upon that landscape, the nature of it, use the stone, use the climate of that area to reinvent himself once again. So he's designing things. This is in Los Angeles, the Sturgis House, which looks like this today. He tries new ideas like a house completely designed with circles. This was to be built on the Palos Verdes Peninsula, never built. He designed car dealerships and gas stations and motels for this new American city, the suburban cities of the Southwest, booming after World War II. The Guggenheim Museum actually started in 1940, but which was completed just after Wright died in 1959. Again, something extraordinary in its design. Marin County Civic Center that I showed before. This was the capital of Broadacre City and the whole new way of the American life that he foresaw. So here again, this third great chapter of Wright's career after 1940 or so, coming up with all of this inventive stuff. On Rodeo Avenue up in Beverly Hills, this small shopping center. And he was praised and he was published. At the top, these are Bill and Lawrence Lane of Sunset Magazine. And that's Wright, of course, and this is their editor, Proctor Melquist. Or this is Elizabeth Gordon, who is the editor of House Beautiful, and here at Taliesin West in Scottsdale. So for these mass-produced, or these mass-market magazines and so forth, Wright is a favorite and is publicized. So to round up all of this story, again, he was 90-some years old, so many buildings, so many ideas, so much controversy, but you can see why he had such an impact on American architecture. Summed up in this pair of pictures, there on the left is the International Style, the Lever House in New York, emblematic of one aspect of modernism. But there is the Guggenheim there on the right, which says, forget the grid of Manhattan. Forget how you think you're supposed to do buildings in Manhattan. This is organic architecture. He plops it right down there on Fifth Avenue. Now, Wright, as I said, and I'll be talking more about this in my talk in August, had many followers, admirers in the architecture world, apprentices. One, I'm just throwing in one example. This is a house, the Anderson House in Palos Verdes Peninsula by Aaron Green, who was one of Wright's apprentices. And you can see all of the ideas of organic architecture, the not rectilinear lines, but varied geometries, natural wood, stucco ceiling as well, but it kind of the way the colors of this all combined with the wood and the natural stone. Furniture, built-ins, as well as designed specifically for the house. All of these ideas continue. You'll have to wait till my August talk to see more of that, that story. I mentioned that because I did an exhibit at the Palos Verdes Arts Center on Aaron Green, first exhibit ever on him anywhere. And it's on now through May 28th. So if you want to get up there and see it, it's really a nice little exhibit on an important Wright apprentice. And so, I don't know, how do you sum up all of this? He had a fantastic life. He was, in many ways, an unpleasant person to work for, or he was so egotistical, he was so involved in himself. He was always thinking about himself and how to get that next client. And yet, he was also a great spirit. I've known a couple of the original owners of some of his houses, and they all talk about their experience of working with Wright as one of the highlights of their entire lives. So, and his workers as well, Aaron Green, John Lautner, others, they recognized that he was bombastic and he was a showman and he was egotistical and all of that, but they stuck with him. They saw the spirit in him and admired it so much that they worked with him and would not have done anything else. Here he is with one of his cars, painted his signature Cherokee red. This again is out in Arizona. That's Olga Vanna, his third wife, with him. But how do you sum up all of this? Well, he is a great American architect. Remember, as I said from the beginning, modern architecture started in America, not from theories about what modern life should be, but from practical things, about what were our new factories creating. How could we use those for making houses and cities better? And how could we continue to connect humans with their natural state, their natural environment? These are ideas which are just as relevant today as they were back in the 19th and 20th centuries as well. So as I said, I'm really, really happy that the Bowers is doing this exhibit, and hope we can do many more on architecture. There's so much more, but I'm really glad to be able to talk with you today a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright's career. So thank you very much.